Abu Hurairah reported that the Prophet ﷺ said, Islam began as something strange and will go back to being strange. So glad tidings to the strangers. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulullah. Welcome back to the third episode of You Only Live Twice, where we try to navigate Islam and work on our akhirah one episode at a time. This episode topic today, I have to say, was not in the original mix of topics I was going to select. But since the first two episodes were what I feel like a bit heavier, a bit more dense, I decided to change things up a little bit and base this episode on the hadith I just mentioned. This is also the second time I'm recording this episode. I had this episode fully edited. I was just about to post it like this very moment, but I was listening to it over and I just hated it. I'm not gonna lie. I just felt like I was so monotone. Keep in mind, I was just sick and I did record the episode when I was sick, but alhamdulillah, I'm feeling better. I'm feeling more energized. I have like 400 milligrams of caffeine inside of me. So I think this will just do the episode topic a bit more justice. I made a TikTok video about this some time ago, but I'm just so passionate about the whole topic that I think it's just right to dedicate a whole episode to it. And the it is being how others perceive you, or whether it's your culture, friends, community perceive you to be when you start to practice Islam the way that we're supposed to, the way that Islam was brought to us. But mainly, we're going to dive into the culture aspect of things. Hot topic, I know. I feel like some people are going to get mad at me for some things I'm going to say, but I really don't care. And honestly, if you do start getting mad or offended, then maybe it's just because you have some guilt or discomfort knowing that some statements perhaps are applicable to you. A hit dog will holler. So if that's you though, and you think while listening, oh my God, I can relate, or that's how I think, or that's how I perceive things, then don't take it as an insult. It's good that you even have that thought to begin. So as we dive into this topic today, we're going to talk about how to shift your view, your perspective surrounding culture, religion, friends, all of that. Just before we get into it though, this and everything onwards are going to be based off of my own personal experience, my own personal interactions with people. These are all my opinions, and I just want to preface that not everyone thinks like this. So to each their own. I don't want to get any angry DMs, like relax. Now, growing up, I didn't really differentiate culture and religion. For those who don't know, I'm Libyan. I'm from Libya, which is in North Africa, and I was born Muslim, alhamdulillah. I went to Arabic school or like Islamic school on the weekends growing up. So I did know the basics as a child. Like I knew the 5 pillars of Islam, the Prophet ﷺ, Ramadan, Eid, all of that. And of course, when you're growing up, you don't really have the mental ability as a child to really understand everything. And no one is born with that intellect. So of course, to an extent, I can understand and expect that. I think where the line was blurred for me though, was when I entered my teens. I felt like that line that differentiated culture and religion was just blurred a bit too much. Not about like the basic foundation of Islam, but for example, I would think that something had Islamic principles or was halal, but in reality, it wasn't or it didn't. And it was just culturally practiced. Now, in every culture, there is always good and there's always bad. And we often hear like take from the good, leave from the bad. However, I don't think that this is practiced as often as it's said. Growing up, I didn't know that music was haram, for example, just because like Western society loves music. It's so prevalent. Like I listened to it growing up and I talked about this in my first episode. But it's not even just about like Western society and the fact that like everyone listens to music and it's literally everywhere, but it's also very prevalent in our cultures, not just my living culture, but a lot of Middle Eastern cultures, just every single culture. I feel like it's just very, very present. I've even heard of kids whose parents say like, don't listen to music because it's haram, but that was only ever applicable to like Western music or English music. But as soon as, it came to their own music, like Arabic music, or if they're not Arab, like whatever cultural music that they listen to, that never applied to them. That music was never haram, And it's so common too that if I ever told someone who was maybe a bit more cultural or more traditional that I don't listen to music anymore for the sake of Allah, they will label me as extreme or outdated, astaghfirullah, just because I feel like sometimes they want to continue practicing their culture. It's funny because every now and then when I have conversations, people sometimes say, oh, well, music is permissible and there's a difference of opinion in this matter. And I'm like, okay, so what's your opinion based off of? Like, what's your source? Is there any ayat in the Quran you're going to refer to? Any specific hadiths? Like what is it? And I'm not asking that for me because I know my evidences to believe like, oh, music is haram because of X, Y, Z. But it's literally just to see if they know what they're talking about. Because oftentimes if they do, I know what they're I often know what to expect for them to say to validate their argument. It's not even about like who's right, who's wrong. But I swear like 99% of the times when I do ask someone who believes it's halal to prove or to give some evidence, they're not able to. They just don't know. They heard it somewhere and just like ran with it. Like, how do you stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala like that? You know? And it makes me think like, again, it's not about who's right and who's wrong. Forget that whole aspect of it. But how can you firmly believe one thing when you can't even justify it or explain it rationally, let alone shame other people or, you know, treat other people differently because they don't share that same view? All I hear are emotional arguments or even like secular arguments from Muslims, as if the Quran and Sunnah aren't enough to follow. Like, why are you bringing me research papers as if that will change my mind based on a certain stance, right? Like, you realize that a lot of people don't actually know what they're talking about, nor do they care to know sometimes because they have an underlying fear that maybe they're not right about that matter. And this is obviously just, I'm not trying to generalize. This happens sometimes, not all the time. Just keep that in mind with everything that I'm talking about and everything I will continue to talk about. But I just find it so crazy sometimes because oftentimes people who are extremely cultured tend to be so opinionated that it's like they can live their life, but they then want you to live your life based on the way that they perceive things or based on their opinions or based on their practices. And they see it as a problem that you don't want to fulfill certain things that they usually would fulfill traditionally. A lot of times, these individuals will be so insulted by you not wanting to partake in things that are just so evidently haram or bid'ah, or even just having like a difference of opinion regarding something. By you not wanting to continue these traditions or practices, no matter how you execute that, you can feel alienated by a group of people because they might not even think that you're trying to be stubborn, but sometimes they'll think that you're trying to be arrogant by putting a foot down, or they think that you're implying that you know more than them and you're a know-it-all, and that in itself can be seen as insulting. Or, you know, sometimes they'll just straight up think that you're weird. I mentioned this in my TikTok too, where a lot of times there's like a superiority complex at play where people who value culture more than religion think that they're better than you because they practice their culture more than you. You know, like I feel like if you had a spectrum of extremely uncultured to extremely cultured, I'm definitely not extremely cultured. I obviously, like, growing up, there are traditions and things that I do carry, and I carry it with like without any shame. And I don't think it's bad. Like, I think it's so beautiful to have aspects of your culture that you know, carry out throughout life. But I will never, you know, switch my priorities to culture over religion. Like, there are a lot of things that I would never carry down to my kids or force onto others or do myself just because for the sake of culture or for the sake of tradition. And some people just aren't like that. And that right there, like that whole mindset of thinking that you have to prioritize culture over religion, or you value culture over religion to the point where you don't care that you know, surpass religion, or that you overstep the boundaries when it comes to halal and haram because you think your culture is just that much better and it's that much more important. There's arrogance attached to that perspective. And that's a disease of the heart. There was something I heard some time ago, and I'm sure you guys have heard it as well before, but I'm not sure if it's a hadith or it was something a sheikh just said, or it's a saying. Like, for the life of me, I tried looking this up and I couldn't find the exact source, so bear with me with this. But it goes something along like this. There are two types of people that will never learn: the one who is too shy and the one who is too arrogant. And subhanAllah, sometimes seeing the resemblance is so scary among some cultures because you see people who think they know everything and that they're too good to get told what is actually truth or to be vulnerable knowing that they aren't perfect. And there's even this hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said that no one will enter Jannah who even has a mustard seed's weight of arrogance in their heart. And I'm going to give benefit of the doubt and say like perhaps some people genuinely in their heart of hearts are not like that. Of course, we can't generalize. Again, like I don't want to make just blanket statements and say everyone is like this, but we cannot ignore the abundance of people who are. People have to be mindful that disagreement is not disrespect. Of course, as long as you attain the proper approach and mannerism and you have the hikmah when you have the wisdom when you're going into these conversations, great. But wallahi, sometimes like it just hurts my heart, and not in the sense of like, oh, I feel hurt because someone says something about me or someone looks at me in this specific way and it's, I'm getting negative feedback, and like I actually don't care about that. As long as I am able to prioritize Allah, like I really don't care whoever turns their back on me anymore. At least like maybe if you talked to me like 3 years ago or 4 years ago, I'd be crying about it. But it hurts me because it's so sad and gut-wrenching to see like your own people, not just your own culture, but like your own Muslim, like your own ummah, or like your own Muslim brothers and sisters, like have their priorities just mixed up, and they like you get lost like that, like you will end up in such a bad position in the akhirah if people continue living their lives like that. And honestly, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide them all. Allah yahdihum. Like I truly only wish the best, but it really does suck seeing people just waive the importance of prioritizing religion just because they would rather stick to their culture when they contradict one another. I have a few different thoughts on why this could be the way it is, like why some people prioritize culture over religion. And of course, again, I can only speak personally. So speaking about Libya, as again, I'm Libyan, I think this stems not only from arrogance, but also from fear. There's such a small Libyan population, and the country now is so unstable with a ton of political turbulence. I feel like because there's no sense of security, or sometimes some people will feel like there's a lack of community, or the community now is not the same as it was like 30 years ago, 40 years ago, both in the country and outside of the country amongst Libyans. I feel like there's a fear that perhaps one day there won't be a Libya, or like it'll never be the same, or there won't be some type of unity amongst us. And so they're scared that they're going to lose their Libyan identity. And so to compensate for that, they become extremely cultured to the point where they prioritize culture over religion, because they attach their whole identity to being Libyan when instead we should attach it to being Muslim. That's why my Instagram bio right now, if you check my Instagram, I have written on there Muslim first, because that is who we are in the eyes of Allah. That is all we are in the eyes of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not care about our culture, our this, or that, unless it's obviously used as a test amongst us to see, oh, are we going to discriminate? Are we going to treat others differently based on their culture, and so on. I remember I also had this conversation with someone in the summer where we talked a little bit about culture, and I was told that oftentimes the generation before us were so occupied with dealing with huge life events like their country falling apart or like fleeing from war to have thought of Islam the way that our generation does now, if that makes sense. Of course, I'm paraphrasing that, and it was said and put a lot more eloquently than how I just said it now, but now we're just in a better circumstance to be able to prioritize Islam. Like it's not like we're scavenging to survive. Majority of us are not in that position. And so by default, we have more time, more freedom, the ability to focus on Islam. And of course, I'm not saying that as an excuse, because look at the Prophet ﷺ, like he was the one tested the most, him. And if you look at the Sahabas and you look at like his family and all of that, like you see the way that he selected, they were the strongest of believers, and they went through the hardest of tests. So truly, it's not an excuse. I just think it was a perspective worth shedding light on, because that was the first time I actually did think about that. And sometimes just understanding where people can come from allows you to build bridges with them. I kind of sidetracked, but back to the initial point I was trying to make. Before anything, we're Muslim first. That is the core to our identity. Sometimes people like to attach their whole selves to a different title like ethnicity, obviously, but also their job, being a parent, or something else. It isn't that that's bad, but it can become bad when you start to care about it more than you care about Islam, more than you care about Allah. When you start to attach yourself to it more than you attach yourself to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like that becomes so dangerous. And oftentimes, by the way, when you do that, Allah will test you with that thing that you prioritize more. You think Allah cares where we're from? Like I said, it doesn't matter. How well is your excuse going to be when you stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Yawm al-Qiyamah, on the day of judgment, and say that the reason why you disobeyed your Lord was to fit into culture or to please those in your culture who, by the way, will turn their backs on you on that day that you stand before Allah. They will turn their backs on you on Yawm al-Qiyamah. And you think of that and you still want to prioritize culture. You still want to think that culture is more important than religion. Like, where is your God consciousness? True God consciousness, though, because I often see many families or individuals who pray and memorize Quran, which is great. And it is so crucial. Do not get me wrong. Don't twist up the words I'm going to say. Yet they still do the same as I mentioned and prioritize culture over religion to the point where it oversteps the boundaries or the rights that Islam has provided. Because at the end of the day, like, that on its own does not equate you to being God conscious. Simply praying your salah and reading Quran are absolutely foundational in our faith, but Islam extends so much more than that. It has affected every single aspect of life and it is relevant in every single way. Your demeanor. Are you giving other people their rights? Are you fulfilling your own rights and responsibilities? Are you fulfilling your role? There's just so much more to Islam, and your worship is not limited to just your prayer mat. And a lot of people tend to look over that. And again, do not get me wrong. It is absolutely crucial to read Quran, to memorize Quran, to know the Quran. And memorizing Quran, by the way, a lot of people memorize it, but I feel like they don't actually deep it. Like, you have to actually understand it as well, because you want the words and you want the meaning and the message to actually penetrate to you. But again, they're both foundational. I'm just saying you can't ignore the divine rights and laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed onto us in this world. There's a lot of cherry picking in cultures, and it's so sad because it's almost like people will try to weaponize the religion against you for their own immoral gain, like religious blackmail, you know? And again, the goal should be working collectively to what pleases Allah, not distorting truths or manipulating things to support a narrative or opinion you want to believe. I also just find it really ironic, again, like, how can you say that you're religious and you memorize the Quran, which is great, again, but like, how, I don't know how to word it, but it's just like, how do you overlook what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you in the Quran? It's right, you're reading it. It's right in front of you and you don't even want, like, you're not letting, oh my God, I can't. Sorry, again, sometimes I'm just in shock sometimes, and I can just get a little frustrated because it's just really sad. Something I want to mention as an extension to the superiority complex is that it extends to race. Like, yes, there are good people, there are great people. I'm not trying to generalize, but you'll find people who are so racist that it is just crazy. Wallahi, like, even Libyans, for example, if you look at us, we have people on the whole spectrum of looks. You can find someone who's light skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, and then you can also find someone the complete opposite, extremely dark skinned, coily hair, and then you have everything in between. The way Libyans will look down on their own people because of the color of their skin, even though those people who are darker tend to have lineage that trace back generations, but to the eyes of those who are lighter or whatever, they're just not good enough, or they still see that as, oh, I'm going to look down on you because of your skin color. It is insane. Like, don't even get me started too on how some will look down on others who are not even within their own culture. Like, I remember I had some people like these are parents, so when they grew up in Libya, because I didn't grow up in Libya, they would say like, if you weren't even living growing up and you grew up in Libya, a lot of times you were made fun of to a level that is unbelievable. Like you get picked on, you get called names. And I know, again, this isn't for everyone, but it happened. It happened and it can still happen. It's so sad. Like, astaghfirullah, like it's straight up haram. And it hurts my heart because it's so haram. Like, how are you going to impact someone's life like that? Like, you don't know the damage that you can do on someone. And it's so embedded and it's so deeply embedded that, like, oh my God, I can't. Like, I just get really heated sometimes when I think about this. And it could have to do with, like, obviously I grew up in a cultural, like I grew up in Canada and there are a lot of people and from different backgrounds and this and that. But this isn't like something to point at, oh, it's because I grew up in Canada that I see this as wrong. It's because in Islam, it's wrong. It's wrong to look down on other people based off their skin or where they come from or their gender or this and that. Like, there's so many examples both in the Quran and the Sunnah to point at this, you know? For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Hujurat, "O humanity, indeed we created you from a male and a female and made you into people and tribes so that you may get to know one another." Or Surah An-Nisa in verse 58, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Indeed Allah commands you to render trust to whom they are due, and when you judge between people, to judge with justice. Excellent is that which Allah instructs you. Indeed, Allah is ever hearing and seeing." So, since when was where you're from, what language you speak, your skin color, or the way you look ever a basis for you to judge upon anyone? Like, honest to God, it's so sad to see. And again, Allah hadihum, like I really do hope that these people turn to Allah and mend relationships or fix their wrongs before they pass away and have to face everything that they've done in the dunya in front of Allah. But that's what I think about. Like, is it seriously going to take until Yawm al-Qiyamah, like the day of judgment, when you're in front of Allah, to realize that you were wrong? Like, to realize that none of that was worth it? If that's you, wallahi, be scared. You might think that you're above everyone right now, but one day you're going to be humbled, and do not let that day be on the day of judgment. It's so sad, wallahi. And there's such a misconception too that the Middle East is great to live in because of the Muslim population. But wallahi, like, some places are just so rampant and haram to the point that you cannot imagine. It's not like there's no haram, because I promise everywhere you'll go, you will always find good and bad. The same way that every culture there's good and bad, same applies to location. It's not like it's a fairy tale just because you live in a Muslim majority country. You'll still find things like plastic surgery, zina, drugs, alcohol, like all the sorts. It's just, you'll find it all. No matter where you go, it'll never be perfect, but to refer to one place or like your own country as perfect and ignore the growing problems that our societies are facing is ignorant. And it's such a disservice. Take pride in the good for sure, but by overlooking and refusing to admit that we have our flaws, you also deny any room for improvement. And again, it traces back to arrogance in some cases, because you will never look to get better or help a problem if you think you or the society was just perfect from the start. It's sad, and my heart again goes out to those who have lost their ways. Now, growing up, I'm not gonna lie, I did resent my culture a little bit because I saw things that weren't fair. I felt like there were certain expectations that weren't fair, certain opinions that weren't right, and stuff like that. And the problem with that is because I just didn't know true Islam, and I wasn't able to fully separate culture and religion. Growing up in like my young teens, I'd say like when I was literally like 12, 13, that's when I kind of dabbled a little bit. I was just introduced to like feminism. And this is a point I didn't even write on my document, but I just felt a need to talk about it really quickly. I felt like because there was that underlying injustice or underlying unfairness, I saw feminism. Again, I was young. I'm not a feminist. I don't have this opinion anymore. But I saw that as what would give justice. Like, I saw feminism as like, this is where I'm getting fairness in life, and this is the truth, and this and that, and like so liberal. I can't. But really, like, that's what happens when I felt like I was maybe, or like just seeing the mass, or like how common it was for people to be deprived of equality. I know like equality in Islam is not like literally the exact same. There is a difference between men and women. And I'm going to talk about this in depth in a whole other episode, inshallah. There's more so like equity in Islam, but back in my feminism days when I was like 12 and 13, I saw feminism as what would liberate me, because I didn't know that Islam was like that. I didn't know what Islam truly was. I didn't know true Islam. And that is why sometimes like I look at other girls who are really young, and because they see the amount of unfairness that they have in their household or in their culture or in their community, I literally do not blame them for looking out to feminism, because they never really were exposed to true Islam, because true Islam is just. And they don't know that, because a lot of times it's actually used against them. Islam is used against them. People will try to weaponize Islam or religiously blackmail them, and then they're just like traumatized. And it's so sad. And it's hard to explain because I never like blatantly resented Islam, but would now and then get frustrated seeing things around me that I assumed was just normal, like I said. And of course, again, I know what Islam is now, true Islam, not the cherry-picked Islam, not the Islam that supports the lifestyle that one wants to live when they choose to. Again, real Islam is just. Allah has set divine laws, and He gave us all of our rights and rules. It's hard to look back and pinpoint when exactly I was able to differentiate culture and religion fully, but it was definitely when I started to actually look into Islam and see how the Prophet ﷺ was living his life, how his relationships looked with his spouses, his children, the Sahabas, his grandchildren, and knowing what he condemned in the time of Jahiliyyah. So alhamdulillah, I do have that clarity now. And I think that kind of all sprouted when I was like 15, about to turn 16, I would say. Going back to the hadith I said at the start of the episode, which was Islam began as something strange and will go back to being strange. So glad tidings to the strangers. If you relate to this, know that you are doing something right. If you chose to be a little bit of an outcast because you want to prioritize Allah, so be it. I mentioned this in my last episode, but sometimes when it can be a bit more difficult than usual to do something for the sake of Allah because of any external conflict, just envision yourself on the Day of Judgment. Envision yourself on Yawm al-Qiyamah. You literally have to acknowledge that your future self will be proud of you and be thankful that you chose to not participate in things or refrain from things, even if the entire world told you otherwise, that you chose Allah above it all. At the end of the day, you're going to stand in front of Allah alone. All those people who you're trying to please will turn their backs on you. And come that time, you know it won't be worth it. And trust me, I'm saying this as someone who used to be the biggest people pleaser ever. Like, it was so chronic. I had to unlearn that. And with time, like, you just have to continue practicing it. But like with time, you begin to realize that like things are not worth sacrificing. And Islam is one of those things that are never worth sacrificing and is never worth compromising. At the end of the day, like many things in life, you have to get used to being uncomfortable, because oftentimes like that is what is most rewarding. And that's what yields for growth. The whole topic even extends to friends. Wallahi, like it is so much better to be in halal loneliness than haram company and happiness. And when I started to prioritize Islam more, my friend group definitely changed and it got smaller. That never happened abruptly for me. It's not like, oh, one day, like I felt like, oh my God, I love Islam and bye guys, I'm cutting you off. It went from like 0 to 100. But rather it was just really slow. And it was also during COVID. So I think that was definitely a catalyst to it as well. Again, I grew up in a predominantly non-Muslim, not diverse community. Well, communities, because I lived in two mainly growing up. It wasn't diverse at all. I was often the only Muslim in my grade, if not the only one, then just one of the few. In high school, though, there ended up being more Muslims with me. And the proportion was still the same, though. Like it was still mainly or predominantly non-Muslim and not really diverse. It was just to a bigger scale. My friend group, obviously, at the time was a non-Muslim friend group. And nearing the end of high school, as I was becoming my own self and finding my identity of being a Muslimah, I just slowly started to come closer to Muslims. And within myself, like I just found like I didn't want to surround myself majority of my free time with people whose very large core values don't align with mine anymore. Now, I never had a friend group who did horrible things in high school, hence why we were friends and we stayed friends throughout high school. Like, for example, none of them partied, or none of us, like I'm going to include myself in there. None of us partied, drank, did anything crazy, no boyfriends, like none of that. Still though, like with time, my heart craved to be in the presence of people who knew Islam. From that time until now, I made friends and I lost some. That's just life. I disagree with social media sometimes when I hear people say like, oh, you should only be friends with people who are better than you. Because I feel like deep down to the core, like when you look at that statement, it's not Islamic. We each have our own shortcomings. No one is perfect. Like, for example, there can be two friends. One can have the struggle of not wearing makeup, but she doesn't listen to music. And the other might struggle with quitting music, but she doesn't wear makeup. So if everyone is trying to be friends with people who are better than you, then you have to ask yourself, like, what does that even mean? We all have a duty to help others, and it's also just not about ourselves all the time. If that was the case, like no one would be there to help anyone. And again, in Islam, like we know that that is not who we are as Muslims. I feel like Western society has breeded for a whole generation of people to be a bit too selfish. And I'm not saying to be completely selfless, because you can lose yourself for sure and be taken advantage of. But sometimes I think hyper independence is definitely a disservice. And I think it's just a bit too selfish to think that the whole world revolves around you and that everyone has to bend themselves backwards to fulfill your needs, your needs, your needs. Because at the end of the day, one person will never be able to fulfill all your needs. And this extends to like not just friends, family, your spouse. I'm not married, but like 100% this is applicable to your significant other. Your person will not be able to fulfill all your needs. And to say that every single relationship has to be a fulfilling one and they have to be perfect for you and this and that doesn't make sense, because you will never be able to maintain a friendship, a relationship with your family, or a relationship with your significant other if there are no sacrifices. Everyone has to sacrifice something. And this goes on both ends. It's not just like a one-way street. You can't continue to receive and receive and receive and never compromise on anything. That's just not how life works, and you're literally going to end up alone. And especially like that's why I'm not surprised when I see these headlines online of like there's a lonely epidemic and this and that, and it's like, yeah, no wonder, you know. And that's something I can actually attribute to culture. In a lot of cultures, it's very common to build that sense of community. The lonely epidemic is because of this whole narrative that people push out saying that you should be a selfish person all the time, and you shouldn't. Sometimes you should, but sometimes you shouldn't. And you have to find that boundary. And speaking of boundaries, I do think it's important to be able to draw one. At the end of the day, like you're bound to become like the people you spend the most time around. If you don't have a good circle of people, you will imitate their behaviors eventually. No matter how strong you think you are, you will. Shaitan works in such sneaky ways, wallahi. It can start with, you starting to loosen up, you starting to think, maybe this matter isn't such a big deal. Maybe this is okay. You start thinking that things are okay when they aren't. And for me, for example, I always try to be there for people. Obviously, like that's our duty as Muslimin, like we should be there for people. And, I try to give as much grace as I can for that, because again, it's important. But the moment I feel like I'm remotely starting to compromise my core values, which are embedded in Islam, I know I need to take a step back. Like the moment I noticed I'm starting to think a bit differently, it's scary because that is such a slippery slope. You cannot lose yourself trying to help someone, especially when they do not want to help themselves. Again, there is a difference, and like it's very circumstantial, but I'm just saying you can only help someone so much sometimes and try to guide them. But if they continue to want to deliberately live a life where they don't want to improve, or they make decisions that are not pleasing to Allah and it begins to affect you, and rather than lifting them up, like you see yourself coming down, I think that's a moment of reflection that you need to have with yourself. And some people say like, oh, well, you're just not strong enough then. And it's like, although for me, I feel very confident right now with who I am, and I feel like a rock, like no one can budge me. You never know. Like literally nothing is guaranteed. And a lot of times there just has to be measures to prevent. because sometimes prevention is the best route to take. And just because you have friends who are Muslim, by the way, does not automatically make them good. They're not just good influences for you because they're Muslim. I promise, prioritize quality over quantity, and you will notice such life changes. Be in the company of people who wish good for you, genuinely, people who want you to be the best version of yourself. And be that person for others as well. Do not envy people. Don't be jealous. It's better for you to be alone than to be in the company of people who are not good for you. For example, surround yourself with people who talk about Allah, people who are consistent with their salah, people who to the core yearn for a relationship with Allah. And of course, like anything else, there is balance to this and it's very circumstantial. And you have to give grace because, like I said, no one is perfect. I'm not perfect. You're not perfect. No one is an angel. Like, we all make mistakes, but there will be times in your friendships where you're feeling down or low, and that can be mentally, emotionally, spiritually with your iman, and you will need your friend to help pull you up. And there will be times where vice versa, your friend will feel down, and in those ways, you have to be able to help pull them up. There's so much reward for helping others, wallahi, and Allah will reward you so much in the akhirah. There's many hadiths that talk about this, but one I can pull up is this one where the Prophet ﷺ said that whoever would love to be shaded in the shade of Allah, like on Yawm al-Qiyamah, let him help someone in hardship or wave alone. So be there for people when they need you. And don't even be there for the expectation of I'm going to do this so that I get this in return, or in the future I get paid back, or this and that. Do it for the sake of Allah genuinely and sincerely, and Allah will bless you in ways you cannot even imagine and reward you for that in the dunya and the akhirah, inshallah. I was listening to a podcast, and one of the things mentioned was that there's a period in everyone's journey where they are so different because they are starting to do new things. They no longer fit in with their old set of friends, but are not yet developed enough to have gained a new set of friends. And that lonely chapter is something that anyone who has gone from where they are now to where they want to be has to go through. And I think that's so applicable to your journey of becoming a God-conscious practicing Muslim. The best case is that you don't grow alone, that you grow with the people around you, but that isn't always the case with everyone realistically. So if you ever feel like you're outcasted and seen as strange because you begin to choose Allah first, glad tidings to you. The Prophet ﷺ mentioned you. No matter if it's your friends, your community, your culture, society telling you that you shouldn't take religion seriously so young, or you're too extreme for practicing certain things, that is all just noise to tune out. Good people will never say that to you, and they will be so happy to see you have that desire in your heart to change for the sake of Allah. Continue to make dua for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to change you until He is pleased with you, to surround you with good company, and to take away people who are not good for you. That wraps up this third episode. Alhamdulillah. Again, I just want to keep this a little bit more brief, on the lighter or more casual side after the last one especially, and just kind of speak what was on my mind. I feel like I'll have to revisit the topic of friends in some other episode because of the relevance it has to literally everything. But as usual, let me know your thoughts on this episode, inshallah. I'm not gonna lie, I was briefly thinking about actually recording visuals for my YouTube, but I don't know, I record at the most random times, and I just got niqab, so that's why I was thinking about it. But again, I record at the most random times. My house is always full or loud, and I don't record in the same place all the time. So I just think that lack of consistency is just going to be a huge disservice. Anyways, I'm going to be consistent with these from now on. I promise. I was meant to post this yesterday on Sunday, but again, I did just suddenly choose to record or re-record, and I have no regrets, honestly. Until then, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continue to change us until He is pleased with us. May He continue to guide us to the straight path and remain steadfast. May He shower us with His mercy and reward us for all of our efforts to please Him. Allahumma ameen, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.